And now it's official. So thank you again to Barb Stolee, who is a member of our CARE, Congregational Action and Response Ministry team of our Synod. And Barb has extensive experience with mental health, not just with the care ministry team, but in her professional experience and personal involvements as well. So thank you so much, Barb, for bringing this to us, especially as we recognize and raise awareness for Mental Health Week, particularly this whole week, starting Sunday and going through Sunday as well. So a call to all our pastors and lay leaders to remind of what this mental health awareness is all about. So I'll pass it with that over to you, Barb.
Okay, thanks. And thanks to those of you in the Synod office for the opportunity to highlight the work of the CARE Committee. And I just want to clarify that I'm not an expert in mental health, but as Prima mentioned, I do have lived experience, both personally and with extended family in the area of mental health. So increasing our awareness of mental health is important at any time. And the pandemic has certainly shone a bright light on the challenges that many people are facing every day, and the increased mental health challenges for so many. So, okay, let's just make sure we can find this presentation. It was here. Apologies. Okay, can you see that screen? Prima?
I can't see a shared screen there, Barb.
Okay. Is it up now?
Yes.
Okay, we did run through this and it did work. There are always last minute kinks. Okay, so let's talk mental health. First of all, the CARE Committee was established, for those of you who are not aware, by a grant to the Synod from the sale of the building of the Augustana congregation in Edmonton when it closed. And as a downtown church, they saw firsthand the impact of mental health issues on many people in the population in the area around the church. And their gift to the Synod was really a call to our broader church to become more practical in our love of the neighbor with mental health concerns. Our current committee members are Diane Kieran, who was a member of Augustana and has been on the committee for or since its beginning. Pastor Kathy Schmidtke, Pastor Doug Heine, and myself. The priorities of the committee are to raise awareness of the reality of mental health issues in our congregations, and opportunities like this help us to do that. We are educating and training lay people and rostered leaders around mental health issues, not necessarily by being present ourselves, but accessing existing resources, and we'll talk about those later in the presentation. And part of that is in identifying resources that can be helpful and encouraging the development of local responses within congregations to mental health issues. In this presentation, I'll walk through some definitions, some numbers about the scope of the issue, the impact of COVID, and then we'll spend some time exploring that good Lutheran question. So what does this mean on a practical level for individuals and congregations? And we'll have a time of discussion, and I'll wrap up with some resources. And again, these slides can be made available if you're interested. I will have various references on slides that you may wish to follow up. So here we go. Getting on the same page, the definitions. The World Health Organization in 1948 developed a definition of health that has been adopted globally and is still in use. It hasn't been changed. Many of you have probably heard this. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. They go on further to define mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. The Public Health Agency of Canada defines mental illness as being characterized by alterations in thinking, mood, or behavior that are associated with significant distress and impaired functioning. Mental illness can be challenging to diagnose because it's a complex of symptoms, and it can take time for a definitive diagnosis to be identified. And some of the examples of the specific mental illnesses that you'll recognize are listed here. Another one, dementia, falls into this category. Substance dependency has been in the news a lot over the last few years with our opioid crisis. Even in Alberta, Lethbridge has been particularly hard hit. Alcoholism and other drugs of abuse. It's worth noting from a 2006 report from the Government of Canada, 70% of mental health problems have their onset during childhood or adolescence. The impact of childhood trauma from abuse of various kinds, violence, or lack of the commonly understood social determinants of health can emerge later in life as significant mental health issues. And many times when there is disruption in the home, children feel that it's their fault, and they internalize things in ways that adults don't, and are often very inaccurate, and that contributes to illness later on in life. Mental health illness impacts emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. And there generally is not a single symptom that a person has, but as I said, it's a complex of signs and symptoms. The tipping into mental illness is often the extent of the symptoms. So the tip from mental health or coping into mental illness is often the extent of the fears. They become excessive, extreme feelings of guilt, extreme mood highs and lows and mood swings, extreme dependence or increased dependence on alcohol or drugs, excessive anger and hostility or violence, and suicidal thinking. You can question this. Many of us experience these challenges, especially in this pandemic. We've had forced withdrawal from activities and from friends. We often experience significant fatigue and challenges coping, especially if you're trying to work from home with school-aged children these days when all schools are closed. And for those who are not able to work from home, being in a workplace that may not be safe is a significant stressor. Some of those things can tip us from the balance from health to ill health. So how big is the issue? When we're talking about how big the issue of mental health is, I think it's important to differentiate pre-COVID times and COVID times, because COVID has made the issue significantly worse. So pre-COVID times, in any given year, 1 in 5 Canadians experienced a mental health illness or addiction issue. So think of those numbers when you look out at your congregations. When we met on a Sunday morning, if you had 100 people there, 1 in 5 of those potentially would have had experience with a mental illness. By the time Canadians reach 40, that number moves to 1 in 2. So maybe that's the number that is closer to what is represented in your congregations. Income has a big impact on mental health. Canadians in the lowest income group are 3 to 4 times more likely to report fair or poor mental health, and that's regardless of age. Mental illness has a huge impact on the economy and on work productivity. Mental health is the leading cause of disability in Canada. In 1998-99, I was doing a research paper around disability, and it was predicted then that by 2030, disability would, or mental illness would be the leading cause of disability in Canada. And here we are in 2021. We've gotten there more quickly than we had anticipated. The term burden of disease is a population health term that refers to the human and the economic costs resulting from poor health. The burden of disease of mental health issues is 1.5 times greater than all the cancers put together. There was a study reported out in 2016. It was based in Ontario that investigated suicide. And at that time, in 2016, they reported that on average, there are 11 deaths by suicide experienced across Canada every day. They reported 2% of adults and 14% of high school students report having seriously contemplated suicide in the past year. This is pre-COVID. So think of an average classroom of 25 students. 2 or 3 of those students in an average classroom would have contemplated suicide. Further, 4% of high school students reported having attempted suicide, have actually developed a plan and attempted suicide. So that's 1 out of 20, 1 student out of a classroom size of 25. That number was pretty shocking to me. Further, the economic impact of mental illness. The burden of mental illness, again, 2011 data, takes a while to get our data updated. This information is 10 years old, but 10 years ago, the cost of the burden of disease of mental illness in dollar terms was about $51 billion a year, which included healthcare costs, lost productivity, and reduction in health-related quality of life. That equated fully to 2.8% of GDP that year. From a 2010 study, in any given week, at least 500,000 employed Canadians were unable to work due to mental health problems. So just making this a little more potentially real for our province, assuming that mental illness is dispersed equally in the Canadian population, and assuming that Alberta has 10% of Canada's population, it's actually a little more than that, but for ease of numbers, we'll use 10%. Then in 2010 in Alberta, there were 50,000 Albertans who were not able to work due to mental health problems. The population of Alberta is roughly distributed 1/3 in Calgary, 1/3 in Edmonton, and 1/3 throughout the rest of the province. So then, based on that 50,000 number, anywhere between 16 and 17,000 Albertans in each of our major cities and throughout the rest of the province were unable to work due to mental health problems, 16 to 17,000. Again, that number I thought was really quite stunning. The Kellogg Foundation is an American organization that focuses on children, and it works with other organizations to enable all children to realize their potential. They award grants and conduct research to support their work. And this is a report of a study that was done on the impact of COVID and published in January of this year, or undertaken in January of this year. And the report is based on an American study, but I think our Canadian numbers, from what I've read, are not too far off. So the baseline incidence of anxiety and depression in the adult population from January to June in 2019 was around 11%. When they surveyed that same group in January 2021, 41.1% of individuals were reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression. And the report indicates that anxiety and depression varies by age group. It's highest among the 18 to 24-year-olds, where well over half of them are reporting signs of anxiety and depression. These are students, those who are just entering the workforce. They often are frontline workers. They are retail workers and servers who may have less opportunity to be perceive that they are safe in their work environment. They're at an age of very social activity that has been curbed significantly for them, and they are experiencing higher rates of anxiety and depression. The next highest impacted group are the 25 to 49-year-olds. These are the folks that are supporting younger families. They're juggling childcare and working from home, or continuing to be required on front lines where they are at more risk of COVID. The older cohorts are not immune, so the 50 and over crowd are also experiencing rates of anxiety and depression that are significantly above the baseline. All groups are experiencing financial stressors related to COVID, and that's a source of the anxiety and depression. When job loss hits a household, anxiety and depression increases. So again, well over half of households where there has been job loss are impacted by anxiety and depression. However, those who have not had job loss are not immune. And again, roughly 3 times the baseline individuals are reporting anxiety and depression related to COVID. And again, income, not unexpected. Individuals earning less than $40,000 a year report a higher incidence of anxiety and depression, but those earning over $90,000 a year are not all that far behind, with just under half of those people reporting increased anxiety and depression. One's status as an essential worker or a non-essential worker has a significant impact on issues around mental health. So essential worker, 43% of essential workers are reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression versus 30% in non-essential workers. Again, non-essential workers are not immune. Those who are deemed essential workers report increased use of substances to cope: alcohol, drugs. 25%, a quarter of them are reporting increased substance use versus 11% in non-essential workers. And again, this was a piece that was fairly stunning for me. Essential workers in this study seriously considered suicide. 22% reported seriously considering suicide in the past 30 days versus 8% for non-essential workers. And what we have learned from catastrophes or natural disasters in our province, we know that the mental health impact of disasters outlasts the physical impact. The fires in Fort McMurray lasted a couple of weeks. The dislocation of individuals, families out of that community lasted months, but the impacts of the mental health impacts of that experience are continuing to be felt. I heard on CBC this morning, as we had one of the anniversaries of the start of the fire and the evacuation, they are still having people come into the mental health offices in Fort McMurray seeking support as they continue to work through the challenges that have resulted from that experience. We learned from the floods in High River that the psychological distress from something like that can last easily 3 years. And May 2020 analysis, and sorry, I have not referenced this one, but it projected, based on the economic downturn and social isolation, we would be seeing additional deaths of despair. So deaths from suicide and alcohol or drugs right up through to 2029. I want to share with you resource that I found when I was trying to work through and understand and come to terms with the death of a suicide within my extended family. Suicide is one of those areas of mental health that is difficult to talk about, and we tend not to do it necessarily particularly well. When my cousin died, we were advised that he died, but there was no discussion of the cause of death. He was a young man, so of course that raised questions. I came across this book as I was wrestling with that issue. It's by Father Ronald Rolheiser, a Catholic priest of the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. He's a Canadian, was born in Macklin, Saskatchewan. He's the author of 15 books on various subjects, and if you're not familiar with his work, I would really encourage you to become familiar with his work. He's a very compassionate priest. And I share this resource. He has a view of suicide that I have not encountered before, and I want to read a quick excerpt from the introduction to the book. It's an address to a congregation after the funeral of an individual who had died by suicide, and his brother shared this information. So here's the quote. When someone is stricken with cancer, one of three things can happen. Sometimes the doctors can treat the disease and in essence cure it. Sometimes the medical professionals cannot cure the disease, but can control it enough so that the person suffering from cancer can live with the disease for the rest of his or her life. Sometimes, however, the cancer is of a kind that cannot be treated. All the medicine and treatments in the world are powerless and the person dies. Certain kinds of emotional depression work the same way. Sometimes they can be treated so that in effect the person is cured. Sometimes they cannot ever really be cured, but they can be treated in such a way that the person can live with the disease for his or her whole life. And sometimes, just as with certain kinds of cancer, the disease is untreatable, unstoppable. No intervention by anyone or anything can halt its advance. Eventually it kills the person and there is nothing anyone can do. My brother's depression was of that kind, the terminal kind. Rolheiser provides an understanding of suicide that is full of wisdom and compassion, and that can bring comfort, I believe, to those who struggle with a loss through suicide, just as it brought comfort to me. Rolheiser describes despair as a weakness, not a sin, and talks throughout the book of suicide as disease, the emotional equivalent of cancer, a stroke, or a heart attack. And as with any sickness, we can love someone and still not be able to save that person from death. With suicide, it's important to recognize that one is dealing with an illness that, like cancer or heart disease, can be terminal, irrespective of every human effort to restore health. There are sicknesses that no human can cure. He uses the image of Jesus appearing to the gathered followers that we're maybe coming up to in Luke in our lectionary readings. As Jesus moved through the locked doors to appear before his disciples, he also moves through the locked doors of the hearts of the despairing to bring grace and compassion to places that no human is able to reach. And I found that a very comforting message in my struggle with my cousin's death. I'd really recommend getting hold of this book. It's very accessible. It's easy to read. It's 75 pages, and I think can be used as a tool to inform yourselves, but also to be shared with extended family members that may be struggling with suicide. So you think, well, I'm not depressed, and I'm not suicidal, but I'm not feeling great either. And that's how Joe and I were feeling, and we didn't really have a word for it until we came across this article that was shared with us by Adam Grant out of the New York Times. And the article is titled, "There's a name for the blah that you're feeling. It's called languishing." He defines languishing as a sense of stagnation and emptiness. It's not depression, but it's not flourishing either. And I could certainly identify it. It felt helpful to have a name for what I was feeling. He notes that individuals who are languishing often don't recognize their decline, and so they don't seek help. But some concerning information is coming out of Italy as they are doing follow-up research on healthcare workers following the early and intense experience with COVID in Italy. They are finding that languishing is a risk factor for post-traumatic stress disorder in healthcare professionals. And while the research is focused on healthcare workers, there is work beginning to be done with survivors of COVID who have gone through the intensive care unit. They're also experiencing PTSD or maybe experiencing PTSD, and especially those who are having long COVID. Languishing can be counteracted with flow, so getting absorbed in some meaningful challenge or sometimes something where your sense of time and self melt away. You've probably all had the experience of getting into a good book and just page after page you're turning, and all of a sudden 3 or 4 hours have passed. That's the kind of absorption in something that they're talking about when they talk about flow. They go on to talk about ways of dealing with languishing, and the first strategy is to name it, to give voice to the quiet despair, to light the way out of the void. I love this article. It's short, you print it out, it's 2 pages, it's a quick read. Schedule for yourself some uninterrupted time. And again, if you've got young children, this can be challenging, but even 5 minutes of unbooked, uninterrupted time can be very helpful. On every airplane flight you take, you hear in the safety briefing, you have to put on your own mask before you can help others. And the same holds true in this environment. These are difficult and challenging days for everyone. We all need to take care of ourselves if we're going to be able to help others. And pastors and our lay leaders are not immune to needing to be reminded about self-care. The Canadian Mental Health Association has a handout on self-care on their website, and I've kind of summarized the headings here, but it's a kind of a cute infographic that you can share with your congregation members. I'd encourage you to find it and share it widely. Excuse me. It talks about self-care, taking time to do things that you enjoy or that make you feel better. You don't need large blocks of time, but you do need intention and commitment to make time for self-care. And some of the strategies are elaborated there. You can read through them. Just a couple that I want to highlight. Physical fitness. You don't need to have a gym membership where you can go anyway, but you don't need to have a gym in your home to appreciate the benefits of increased exercise. Walk around the block at lunch. Set the alarm on your phone for an hour every 2 hours so that you get up and move. If you're someone who gets totally absorbed in what's in front of you on the computer, set yourself some reminders to get moving. Limit technology use. Those of you who live on Facebook or Twitter will know that they have both become very toxic platforms. Don't spend a lot of time on there. They're not particularly uplifting. And relaxation and meditation, there are lots of apps that you can use to practice those. I'm sure most of you have little books from various conventions sitting around that can be great journals to use. So now it's your turn. So I encourage you to think about your faith community, where you are practicing. These are questions only intended to spur your thinking. We're not going to work through them, but based on the information that you've heard, how do you see the risks in your community? Given the new virtual world, how do you notice what's happening with your families and your members who don't have the benefit of reading body language in person? How are faith community leaders sharing the care with the entire community? You as rostered individuals can't do it all. How do you recognize when a trauma therapist is indicated? I have an article that I read in preparation for this that suggested turning the question ultimately when someone comes to you for support. They asked how would it change the conversation if you asked what has happened to you versus what's the matter? And lastly, how are you taking care of yourself? So those are the questions. I'm going to hopefully stop sharing and hopefully have some discussion. So we'll leave it open at this point. What are your thoughts or responses or comments or concerns? Kendra, you're on mute. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Sorry about that. I've posted the last few questions that Barb had in her presentation on our chat as well, if you'd like that for a reference. But feel free to include your questions in the chat as well. Go ahead, Dave.
Hey, thanks, Barb. I found your presentation very, very helpful, and I will go back and review it more thoroughly. But let me see if I understand this. I'll ask one question and then leave it for others, but I have about three. So from what you're describing, mental wellness to mental illness is more of a continuum of being than two states of being. And I think it was brought home to me when you were talking about, and the order is irrelevant perhaps, but languishing, blahs, depression, PTSD, it's a journey or an experience that can move you from one state to another. Am I close?
Yeah, absolutely. And I liked Rollhauser's description of oh, it's gone now, but yeah, yes, it is a continuum. Someone who is who maybe have been given a label of a mental illness certainly shifts into mental wellness in terms of being able to cope in the everyday when they are treated in a way that either eliminates the problem or if it is controlled. They certainly can function well. Yes, it's very much a continuum. What I'll go to the second question that I had in terms of in the virtual world, rostered people, how are you keeping in touch with your families and understanding what's going on with them?
Prior to jumping into that, I noticed a couple of hands up.
Oh.
Bishop Larry and Kevin, did you have a question as well? No, sorry.
My comment might come just a little bit later in the questions bar, but thank you too for the presentation. It's been very, very helpful. The article around languishing I had shared with the roster ministers a couple of weeks ago too, and it's getting its way around, which is a good thing. Barb, I was struck this morning. I was working on an article for Canada Lutheran, we always have to write 17,000 years ahead of the actual distribution of the Canada Lutheran. But the theme for July and August is CLWR's 75th anniversary. And so I was writing this morning and about when I think of CLWR, I often think of international, but I've been, because of my experience with High River and with Fort McMurray, have been much more connected with the national pieces and partnerships with CLWR. So I was writing an article about that this morning, my experience with Fort McMurray. And your comment around this continued trauma, this continued mental health illness concern that's still very prevalent. This is something I've been raising with pastors since last April during COVID time. And this is my concern, one of my concerns about moving forward is the trauma of the PTSD, all of those things. So thinking about pastors, particularly rostered ministers and lay leaders, what are ways that we might assist them in terms of this trauma, both their own and then in their caregiving and pastoral caregiving of others as well. I think it's a long-term piece for us.
Yeah, very much so. And some of the statistics around healthcare are quite frightening. Up to 30% of healthcare professionals are considering leaving their profession after COVID. They'll hang in there till COVID, but then they're considering leaving because of the stress that they have experienced and trying to function while living with PTSD. It's a big challenge. One of the ways, and if I can slip back, I'll try this. I'll describe it. It's on the last slide that we'll get to. There is a group here in Calgary called Prairies to Peaks. We will never have enough counselors or therapists for all the people that are going to need the support. This organization in Calgary does peer support training. And they are offering a training in June. If you have members of your congregation, or Wallace at All Saints here in Calgary, where I attend, and I took part in this training, so maybe Wallace will want to speak to that or can comment on it as well, whether he wants to or not. But I think that's one approach. Share the burden, share the care, become informed about how to appropriately support people who are experiencing mental health challenges. And this, I think, was a very strong program. Wallace, do you want to add?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it was I thought it was a very well done program, especially for people who don't know a lot about how to support people with mental health. It's a good starter program. For Barb and myself, we might have felt a little advanced for the program, but it was still very well. I don't know about, can't speak for Barb, but for myself, I definitely took something out of that and thought it was a great opportunity. So yeah, I really encourage you to think about that in your own congregational settings, to train. You can get 3 or 4 people. It's not the, there's one question there similar to mental first aid. It's not the same. Mental first aid really helps you triage. This is more about walking with people through the longer journey, which is really the peer support comes into play, because this is what we're going to be doing. And like I said, rostered leaders aren't going to be doing that on their own, or they're going to be burnt out and joining the other healthcare professionals and leaving the ministry. So what I was suggesting is 3 to 4 people. If you can convince 3 to 4 people to take this training, for us it was Barb and myself. It was because it's a 4-day program, so there's a little bit of intensity to it. But if you can get 3 to 4 people to commit to that, that gives you 3 or 4 support people in your congregation that can start helping walk with people through their mental wellness challenges and their mental illnesses. And so I know in our own congregation, between all the different training we've done, and for people who've had experience, we've been very fortunate to have people who either have education or experience, direct experience in their profession dealing with mental health. That we have I have at least 3 or 4, 5 people I can go to if I'm working with someone who's dealing with a mental illness or mental wellness issues. So I think it's having a peer support program like this is so vital to really trying to open our congregations up to walk with people with mental illness. So yeah, I'm a huge supporter of the program. Thought it was a great program. Like I said, it's because of the commitment of it. It was hard to. I was able to convince Barb and myself to go, but others wouldn't work during the week and stuff. But it was like I said, it was a really good program, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. So I really encourage you to consider. And I don't know, Barb, is this one virtually, or I didn't see the details of it?
Yeah, there is a course that they are offering in June, and it will be virtual because indoor gatherings are still not sanctioned, so they cannot offer it in person.
So that means that people outside of Calgary can access it easier.
Yes, yeah, you can access it from your living room as you do lots of these other programs. The program is not, it has a tuition and it's not insignificant. The CARE committee, I checked with Diane, will entertain scholarships for attending the program. So don't let finances be a barrier to you or folks in your congregation. We will attempt to support the tuition to the extent that we can.
And
So,
clergy you can use your continuing education. It was 400 and something it cost us. Really, for us who have education, continuing education funds, it's not really a huge stretch. But for a congregation, yeah, it's a barrier if you don't have funding. But as Barb said, if there's funding available through the care, not the care creation team, the mental health care creation, the care team, then you can have that. We have 2 teams with care in it. So yeah.
Another piece in answer to your question, Bishop Larry, would be to have an honest conversation with yourself. And if you have a sense that you need support, find it. You've got a generous benefit through your benefits plan to support counseling. If you personally have issues of trauma in your life, or if this has been an experience of trauma for you, find a trauma-informed specialist who can support you through that. It is a special approach that generates very positive outcomes when it is appropriate. So have that conversation with yourself. Let's not be those people who say, oh, I'm fine. And no, we're not. Let's walk the talk and model the behavior that we're wanting to see.
Thank you for that, Barb and Pastor Wallace. There certainly has been quite a bit of interest in knowing more about the program, and noting on chat your response to Bishop Larry as well, Pastor Wallace. We'll try and make that information available, but participating in the peer support program as well, and going from there. We'll try and include it along with the video and the PowerPoint presentation as well. I want to highlight the question Pastor Kevin had, starting with the chat. Is this training similar to the mental health first aid, or how is it different?
Yeah, and Wallace touched on that. The mental health first aid is in some ways like the physical first aid course that you take It talks about how to recognize symptoms and early intervention. This peer support program provides tools and strategies for the long haul. This is walking with someone through their acute illness, or not acute in terms of needing hospitalization, but through the phase of their illness where they are not coping. They are more than languishing. They have tipped into mental illness and they need support. So it's an approach to do that in its peer-to-peer. It's not, they're clear, this is not professional intervention. That needs to happen in with different people and in a different place. But just like when, and maybe this applies more to women than men, when you're really upset, what do? You find somebody to talk to, a friend, you go for coffee. And it's that kind of support, someone who will listen and be able to help you sort through your thinking, to be able to challenge distorted thinking at the moment. But it's not therapy. It is a friend walking alongside.
Thank you, Brenda. And thank you, Brenda Waller, for your comment that you took part in the sanctuary course at Hope Lutheran led by Pastor Marty Tour. And also a question, how do we identify those who may be in need? Many of us go to the default response of I'm fine when we are really not fine.
Well, and I'd encourage you to find that article on languishing, because it has given a name to something. I don't know how many mornings Joe and I said, well, how are you doing? I'm kind of blah, I'm kind of flat too maybe, but I'm kind of flat. And now we have a word for it. And maybe instead of saying, I'm fine, it's, I'm languishing a bit and I'm struggling with whatever. And naming it may help others to recognize it in themselves and begin to explore how they can seek support.
Oh, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, I'll stop.
Oh, okay. I think after I put the question down, I realized that a starting answer is to probe beyond the I'm fine if you're concerned about somebody, and just ask some open-ended questions that aren't intrusive.
Mm-hmm.
and to walk and to listen and to walk alongside, because advice is pretty cheap. It's like,
Yeah.
doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Are there other comments? I mean, you've highlighted some of the resources that I have put on the last slide, and I'm not going to waste the time to try and pull it up. I'll just talk through them, and you can see them on the slides if you get them. So have a look at the Synod website for the Congregational Action and Response for Mental Health, the Care Committee website. There's a lot of information on there. There are articles, there are video clips for discussion starters. There are a couple of videos around dementia by individuals that you will recognize from our Synod. And again, the Care Committee will contribute funding for participation in training, and contact the committee through Diane Kieran for information about that. Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries has 2 courses that congregations can access. The first one is an 8-week course on equipping the church to support mental health and well-being. It's scripted, it uses videos, there is a discussion facilitation guide. It's a very helpful kind of resource. The second one is a 4-week course specific to faith, grief, and COVID. And it follows the same format. It's very helpful discussion starter. If you've got people in your congregation that are languishing and are wanting to talk, this is a great course. 4 weeks. I'd suggest doing it weekly because then you don't lose the momentum. The Canadian Mental Health Association. If you've never been on that website and you have an extra hour or two, go on it. There is such a wealth of information there for resources for a wide variety of issues. I was particularly taken with some of their resources for children. They have a new resource that they have recently posted on talking to children about suicide. They have a resource for children on living with a parent with bipolar disorder, living with an alcoholic parent, living with a parent who is distressed. And as I mentioned earlier, kids often think that whatever these challenges are their fault. And these tools can help change the frame of reference for kids. I've mentioned Prairies to Peaks Consulting with the peer training course. The group also does well-being coaching for individuals and groups. And just re-emphasizing, there will never be enough therapists for all the work that needs to be done. And again, just another pitch for getting your hands on this book, Bruised and Wounded. Whether you will see individuals or families in your congregations impacted directly by suicide, you are probably hearing about families in the extended reach of your congregation that are impacted by suicide, and many people struggle to get their heads around it. People struggle to even talk about it. As I mentioned, the death may be acknowledged, but the fact that it was a suicide may not be until there is further probing. I recently listened to the funeral service of an individual who died by suicide, and it was not mentioned in the funeral service. There was an allusion to a mental health concern, but even in our church, we're not comfortable in sharing that kind of information. And maybe the funeral service isn't the appropriate place to do that. So don't hear me say that, but it's an example of how reluctant we can be. So I will, with 3 minutes left, turn it back over to Prima.
Thank you so much, Barb. And as we close, I want to highlight and acknowledge and thank Pastor Dave for his closing comment. And do not accept that this is the new normal. Please be sensitive to cultures that encourage being fine. Chaplains and cameras to the police and to emergency service personnel found that individuals chose to process their struggles in more acceptable ways, like the bar. Thank you for acknowledging, and thank you for this time in opening our mind to more ways that we see. Sometimes we don't see, sometimes we see differently. But in recognizing that the concerns for mental health, the struggles with mental health are right in front of our eyes, are real, are present, and are so much in need of our partnership to care, our partnership to love, our call to be God's loving image to those who are suffering, and also ways that we can identify that. So thank you so much, Barb, for bringing, I know this is a huge topic, and we had many discussions of what are we going to pick and choose at this point. But thank you for bringing this to us in a package where we can take and maybe open it more for further discussions. Addressing it at this time during Mental Health Awareness Week was certainly this reason to say, let's encourage this conversation. Let's talk about it. Not just as a concern issue somewhere out there, but as something we need to talk about here now in our community for ourselves too. So thank you for that reminder, and thank you for bringing those resources to our attention as well. And as ministers, rostered and lay, we are called and reminded of who we are, God's children. Meek, gentle, empowered, filled with God's Spirit to go and struggle with, to go and rejoice with, and to be with each other and ourselves. So may we go hearing this prayer, which is again referred to in the Sanctuary Mental Health course, prayer attributed to Saint Francis of Assisi. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, and in case languish, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. And in that prayer, may we be blessed to be the voice. May we be blessed to hear the voice as well. Thank you again for joining us, and may God's peace, may God's strength, and may God's love be with you through the time of this blah as well. God be with you.
Blessings all.